U. Seema Maya. Seema is a practicing academician, architect and urban designer with research interests in the areas of architectural theory, design, urban regeneration and urbanism in India. She is association with RV College of Architecture in 2009. Seema has been actively engaged in teaching architecture and urban design studios in the undergraduate and postgraduate programs. She's also taught courses in urban form theory and conducted dissertation seminars. She is also guided postgraduate thesis in urban design. She is currently involved in teaching history and theory of architecture and urban design studios. She has represented the college at the National IUDI Urban Thesis Seminar and NASA panel discussion.
Hello and welcome to the UGC lecture series on architecture. Today we are doing the second session on historic urban form, which is a part of the urban design discipline. In our last session, we focused on urban form, urban morphology, historic urban form and various concepts and approaches to reading these. This session, we will largely focus on understanding the evolution of urban form by comparing it across diverse cultures, contexts and settings in the Western context this time. Now, last time we looked at an introduction. This time we will focus on ancient period to early pre-modern and how urban form has evolved. Now, we are going to look at urban form through history. Now, whenever you want to do an analysis or an evolution of urban form, first thing, put a framework and have a timeline. Now, what is this framework based on? Now, to do any analysis, first of all, we take a combination of scientific research, a lot of rational processes and methods are applied to understand this. Finally, we apply all this together to get a very relevant image of what the character of this urban form must have been like at any given point or time. But there is a factor you have to know and remember, which is all interpretations are largely depend on what our worldview was at any given point or time. Also, archaeologically, we keep unearthing new facts each time, and with new facts, the basic perception we have of what the character was of urban form keeps evolving or changing. Now, this particular analysis, what I will present today in this session, is largely based on man-made interventions or very conscious interventions made because of acts of men, and that has changed the urban form. I will not largely be focusing on how form changed through time only, the gradual change in form like I discussed in process, but how man through his conscious action changed urban form. Then I am also going to talk quickly about a framework. Now, the framework of how to divide and study urban form for this session and all the subsequent sessions I present is based on the major determinant changes or influences or actions or events that largely changed form or the nature of form. So, we see a clear difference physically in the form and also how people used it or how that form was accommodated or how that form was appropriated by people. That is a word, how form got appropriated. So, what were these periods? Now, I have got an ancient period, a medieval period, a pre-modern period, a modern period, finally the current phase we are in. But today we will start with the ancient period and end with pre-modern period. Now, if the question is why am I ending a session at pre-modern, now the framework can also be done in another different way. Now, what is that method? I can also read the analysis or historic urban form largely based on pre and post industrial revolution. Why industrial revolution? Because the nature of cities as we knew them dramatically changed post 18th century because suddenly density increased. Why? Because factories came about and the machine age changed the way cities were lived in or how people migrated into cities. They became complex and dynamic entities the way we knew them. So, I can also divide or read this period largely as pre-industrial and post-industrial period. Now, in today's session, the timeline I am presenting is looking at pre-industrialization, which is ancient period, which has a few subdivisions to it, then the medieval period, Finally, the pre-modern period, which has three parts: Renaissance, Baroque and the dawn of Industrial Revolution. Now, largely I will focus from ancient period, which is Neolithic proto-settlements, till Baroque. Why? Because after the dawn of Industrial Revolution, we suddenly move into a transitional period or phase. Now, in this transitional phase, suddenly, like I argued before, density increases and the very form, shape, character of the city entirely changes. Post this, we will look at it as a different session and see the modern movement, which has City Beautiful, City Industrial by Garnier, New Utopias, out of which we recognize a lot of architects who have contributed their works here, from Corbusier to probably Paulo Soleri. Then you have Archigram. Finally, we do the current phase or the contemporary phase, as we may call it. In that contemporary phase, we see new urbanism, we also see architects, we see everybody who was deconstructivist architects contributing to the way urban form and city design is largely. But for today's session, I will simply limit it to ancient period ending with Baroque. Now, to begin any discussion on the ancient period, okay, urban origins in prehistory, that's what I would like to call it. I will not talk about the geological earth time, or I will not argue about how man evolved or how Homo sapiens came about, but focus directly on when we found the first settlement. For all practical purposes in this session, let's talk about that. Now, when did that happen and why did that happen? In late Neolithic period, all of a sudden settlements came about. What were these settlements about? These settlements were a product of the agricultural revolution. Now, what is this agricultural revolution that came about? Man suddenly was no longer nomadic and he started practicing agriculture and a sedentary lifestyle. Now, where all did agriculture come about? Agriculture largely came about in all the parts earmarked on that drawing you are looking at. Now, of course, the origin of it was in the Fertile Crescent, which is where Mesopotamian or one of the earliest river valley civilizations came about. But right now, let's focus more on the larger Neolithic settlements. So, let's begin at the earliest and most famous of them, which is Jericho. Now, let's look at the slide and first try and understand what are you reading in terms of form in this. Now, the slide I have is a combination of an archaeological excavation, an aerial image or a view showing you how the larger context or precinct is, then we are looking at some artist reconstructions and then some archaeological plans. Now, what you notice, of course, is a defensive wall. You also notice the use of mud brick and stone, most of which is locally available in and around Jericho in the Jordan Valley. Now, hold on to the thought. We will see one more now. Which one are we looking at? We are looking at Çatalhöyük. This one's in Anatolia, Turkey. What are you looking at? Again, notice the use of a very local mud brick wall. That is what is locally available. You see the use of the local material and then try and see the beehive pattern in which these forms are interconnected to each other. And then look at the way the roof in the image is being used as a social space. Now, there is also an image of the excavation that shows you the cohesive way these units are formed or planned. Now, the part plan put up there shows you the idea of how these forms are interlinked to each other. And if I were to summarize the two slides we saw, what would it be? I will read all the further periods on a similar framework. First, we will look at the factors that led to the emergence of any culture or civilization or settlement. Then we will look at the factors that affected, then the urban form of it. Then we will look at the response or determinants. In the previous session, when I discussed determinants as a method of analyzing form, I argued that you could have a natural, man-made or a local determinant. Largely, we will look at the natural and the man-made determinants here. So, summing up on what did we learn in the Neolithic proto-settlements by looking at a comparison between Jericho and Çatalhöyük, what we understood is that as urban form, I looked at the walled city or the open city. As a determinant or a response which was natural, you saw a response to topography. It responded to the terrain it was situated in. It used local materials and simple methods of construction that I could apply using stone tools, because we are in the Neolithic phase. And then we saw man-made determinants. Now, see, society has not evolved to that extent or society is no longer as complex as we see today. So you simply look at a larger political structure, maybe economy depended on barter, and larger worldviews. See, early Neolithic settlements or Neolithic period, people largely focused on animism beliefs. So the worldview guides the way you build too. Now the next set I am looking at is I move on into the idea of early river valley civilizations. The example I have put up for you is Mesopotamia, but before I dwell into Mesopotamia, let us quickly bridge the gap and talk about the argument that if you are talking about Neolithic settlements, then you have to understand that at the end of Neolithic, all of a sudden the world is a different place to live in. Now we are doing large scale agriculture, and agriculture always needs a division of labor. Now with the division of labor, you end up having a stratified society, and that stratified society takes you to trade, gives rise to writing, and you have a civilization that is born. In this particular one, what you really see again is the same defensive wall, but the city is more complex now. When you look at the form of the city, you have what I call a citadel complex with a religious structure or a ziggurat in this case, and you are also looking at the larger pattern of urban form where people lived as the second lower town part. In the reconstructions, if you focus on the reconstructions, you can actually see the larger structure of the outside, which is outside the citadel complex, is very organic, but inside the citadel complex, which holds the palace and the ziggurat, it is very organized. You almost see a geometric pattern evolving. So what did we learn in this? What were the factors? Most salient factor to remember is environmental determinism. All early settlements were based on the location they were in and how the environment largely contributed to the successful evolution of these civilizations. Also, there was irrigation, and then just like I argued, the four basic ideas, which is you do agriculture, and then because of agriculture you have surplus labor and labor division. Labor division leads to a stratified society, that leads to hierarchy, power systems and territoriality lead to trade, and then trade and because of trade you need writing. So that is how societies evolve, and more interaction, more complex societies, more density in these cities. We will look at further more complex societies. Next one on the list is Egypt. The example I have chosen in Egypt is the planned settlement called El Lahoun or Kahun. In this example, you can see an almost geometric order or organization of where the workers' settlements are for building the pyramid, and then where the royals and the official settlements are. Now, why is this clear division there? Because you are seeing a hierarchy or a power structure that leads to this division. Now the two reconstructions that are put up there are looking at the separation between the pyramid. When you look at the slide there, when you look at the pyramid versus the settlement, what you are trying to look at or understand is largely how that is more a symbol of power and of monarchy of the rulers there versus how the people lived, people who worked on the pyramid. Now if I quickly sum up what the determinants were, just like we did with the previous Neolithic one, we will understand that topography still plays a large part. When you look at the raised mud brick platforms, climate plays a large part because of mud brick walls, the thickness of these mud brick walls that were used to control the inside and outside temperature and climate. And then you are looking at various construction techniques. So you are looking at mud brick construction, stone, timber, you see walls, arches, trabeated or lintel and post construction. Then you see man-made. So you have politics, writing systems, polytheism as a worldview, the art and culture that's evolving, all influencing the urban form. What I would like to reiterate at this phase is that largely as architects we always focus on monuments, that is we understand buildings and immediate context, but when you do historical analysis of urban form, what we do is we look at the setting of these monuments and the setting of the larger settlement around them. We focus on both and try to see if there is a relationship that is developed between these two. The next of course is the Greek cities or the classical period. We are still in ancient period right now. So looking at the image, again you notice that there is an acropolis which is at the higher level, which has the larger religious structures, and then you have the agora or the public place and the rest of the settlement at a lower level. Now the grid as we know it evolved in Greek times with Hippodamus, but the grid largely responds to terrain, and if you look at the example that is put up there, which is Priene in Asia Minor, you see that it responds to the topography, and the lay of land is what is dictating how that grid is responding to it. Now we will quickly look at the salient points. Now for the first time the notion of a polis or a city comes about. Now what is this city that I am talking about? With the city of course comes a citizenship, which simply means that the countryside and the city are two separate entities now. And then when I have a citizenship, in comes an idea called democracy, and democratic ideas also shape urban form. So here I have an intangible idea called democracy that is using grid as a principle and organizing space. Now what were the salient urban forms and what was the urban planning like? Now the right of way, which is the egalitarian society, largely organizes the form. Also the city consists, as I argued before, of an acropolis, and the lower part which had residential quarters, commercial quarters, marketplaces, theatre, a stadium and a harbour as well. In the early cities are largely developed by accretion, a process of adding units, but then with grid in later Hellenic period, what really happens is the grid starts responding to a terrain and you start seeing an interesting juxtaposition of a grid versus a hilly terrain. So you get steep streets, but the main street leading to the agora would have been in the valley, organized in a way where it is straight and the agora is situated probably at the geographical center. Now the next part is we have to talk about how public place comes about in a Greek city. Now what is this public place? This public place I am talking about is where people meet and discuss, because we are in a democratic setup. So, and this public place is so important that all other buildings, administrative buildings, marketplaces like the stoa, all come about around this agora. That would be a diagram you are looking at of the agora and the larger public buildings. Now how does the agora come about? For this, let us apply one of the methods we learned when we discussed in the design growth of cities, that is the processional path called a Panathenaic way is the blue line that you are looking at, is along which the buildings gradually develop over time in the slides 1, 2, 3, 4 that you are looking at, to finally become the space of the agora of Greek cities as we know it today. The process is called accretion, space as connector. Now to sum up, what were the determinants? The determinants are topography, climate, materials, and you are looking at post and lintel construction now, and then the man-made determinants. Politics takes shape here, and politics determines, or democratic ideas determine the form of the city too, and the larger worldviews of polytheism, theocracy, and socio-cultural, art, philosophy, architecture, everything develops here. In the ancient period, we will also look at one more city, which is the Roman city. Now the Roman and the Greek city are two different entities. So what if we see the grid in the Greek times as well as the Roman times? Romans were empire builders. The focus of the grid was, the idea was to use the grid to build new colonies. It was a way of organizing land parcels or land divisions. Now if you look at the slide, you are looking at Timgad, which is a colony of the Romans which uses a gridiron pattern to organize the city. Now the salient parts of the city include the public place called Forum, which is of course where the Cardo and the Decumanus, marked out in the green and the red, the two main streets, meet. You also have Basilica, the theatre, library, baths and other parts which make up this colony. Now this particular model of laying down the grid is common in most Roman cities. The exception to the rule of course is Rome, because Rome was a series of villages which joined and developed over time. In Rome of course, you do not see a larger public space and then buildings developing around it. What you see is a public space that is contained by buildings largely. So you see compression, a lot of large monumental buildings which symbolize power, which symbolize the empire building, which are attached to each other. Now quickly summing up, what were the factors? Now the factors in this case are how they adopted Greek ideas, whether it was the grid, whether it was post and lintel construction. They adopted these and converted all of them largely into formulae that helped them in aggressive large scale city building. Now this is when of course we had the early ideas on city planning, which of course was Vitruvius. We will also discuss about the public space of the Romans, which is the Forum. Now the image that you see on the slide, which is a reconstruction of the imperial fora over time, looks at how various emperors based on their conquests made addition to the Forum. The Forum comprises of a series of colonnaded halls which go around the central space. Now these colonnaded halls are organized on an axis, which is each central axis connecting the other or is perpendicular to the other, and you organize the space around it. Now the image on top, again going back to the design growth of cities, you are looking at compression as an idea of city building. Now summing up, I will say the natural determinants are bypassed when you lay the grid this time. Now the principal mode was quick, easy, efficient methods of city building. So the grid is a great method to divide land. And then you are looking at a political idea, might and power, legislation, defense. These are the larger man-made determinants on which the city is designed. Then we look at the medieval city. Now with Romans we completed the ancient period, which is we started with Neolithic period and then we ended with Romans or the classical city. Now at the end of classical city, suddenly we have the Dark Ages. Now post Dark Ages we go back to more rural settlement models, since the larger city building ideas are lost. So what you look at when you see a medieval city is, again you see the church, or this is the idea of the rise of church as the central focus here. So you see the church and then a square or a front space that comes about as the most important large open public space in the city. Now this is surrounded for defense purposes by a fortified wall. Also in the medieval period you see either organically grown cities like the example I have, which is Carcassonne in France, or you will notice a bastide or military colony. This is Montpensier that you are looking at here, where the grid is laid down and the city is organized. I have a series of plans here of a medieval city form where the central space is colored in a different shade, and you can notice that that is the larger public space and the rest of the form is more cohesive, more tightly bound. So if I were to talk about or sum up the factors, I will talk about post Dark Ages. So you were looking at a socio-economic decline, gradually shrinking of the old city as we knew it from the Roman times, and the emergence of religion or church as the central power, and then you see the feudal system taking shape now. Now having discussed the larger form of the city, that it is fortified with the church and the square, let us look at what the church square or the public space then, which is in front of the church, looks like. Now the principle to look at here is interlocking spaces as connectors, which is focusing on the image that we have here. In the reconstruction of Piazza del Popolo, this one is from Todi in Italy, you are seeing how there are two smaller squares which interlock with the large public square in front of the church, and the interlocking point always noticeably has a main public or administrative building. Summing up on the response, what are the responses or the larger determinants? I have natural determinants, which is topography, climate. Climate of course is colder, so you have close knit streets. Construction, so you have materials like stone and brick, you see arcuated, as well as you see the evolution of buttresses if you remember late Gothic churches. The representation of religion as a very dominant force, so you see the church or the Gothic churches which soar up to infinity, they are responses of the power of the church. and these are man-made determinants. The next, of course, is we do the pre-modern period. So, having completed ancient, we moved on and did medieval, which was post the Dark Ages, where the city had shrunk, to again re-looking at the city. In Renaissance, you again see how the medieval city now, with trade coming in along with religion, you see the wealth or economy of the city improving. So, the city becomes more complex gradually, where we will look at the neoclassical city or the Renaissance. What is the Renaissance all about? The Renaissance is a revival movement in art, philosophy and new interpretations and experiments in architecture and city planning. So, from the medieval city, which had shrunk in size, which was all about fortification, all about feudal systems, we are looking at trade taking shape, and we are also looking at humanist ideas where you are rethinking or revisiting older concepts of how a settlement type should be, and we are now seeing how to introduce public spaces, how to consciously design a city as vistas, as avenues, as views. And this is of course the time of the universal man, the multifaceted universal man. We can all remember the famous architects and sculptors Michelangelo, Da Vinci and even Alberti, whose treatise on architecture is what we quote to talk about the sudden change or in our perception of what architecture should be like post Renaissance period. Now this is a quick look at the idea of ideal cities, which also take shape in the Renaissance period. Now the idea of what is the ideal city comes about time and again, or arises time and again. The utopic idea of what a good city should be like or the good life in a city should be like keeps re-arising. In this case, you see almost geometric pattern of city making. These are based of course on Alberti's book and larger principles that he laid down for architecture. Now also, moving away from the idea of the ideal city, let's quickly take a look at how public spaces were designed. First thing we should know is these were designed as public spaces, which is, if you take the example that you have here in Rome designed by Michelangelo, you first take a set of disparate buildings which are largely disconnected on a terrain, and then he comes up with a geometric pattern to connect these, responds to terrain, and you have a piazza which responds to the topography as well as the entrances of the build. The facades are redesigned with staircases. So a comprehensive idea of a public space comes about. Quickly putting the ideas of urban planning together, I would sum it up as new experiments in city planning come about, ideal cities based on Alberti's treatise come about, and then they discourage the idea of the medieval multiple nuclei smaller towns for larger cities to come about, and then the power of the church and the monarchy together give rise to new experiments in city planning. And then street networks, they rethink the connect between the city and the countryside. Larger examples of these would be Naples, Rome, Pisa, Florence. What were the determinants? Gradually we have to understand now that the natural determinants do play a part. Topography plays a part, climate plays a part, but more and more the determinants have started turning into man-made determinants. Religion, politics, power, economy, mobility, all these start playing a part. Now in the medieval city, the wheeled traffic was not much, but as trade improves, wheeled traffic improves, streets could no longer be narrow or thin, they had to be wider, they become avenues. That's what you see in the Renaissance city. The last of this is in the pre-modern period is the Baroque city. Now the basic ideas of Renaissance are further developed on, and the power between the monarchy and the church is highlighted here, and you see the grand manner. City planning takes on the idea of large avenues, monumental public buildings, the trivium, which you can see in the plan of Rome for Pope Sixtus V, and an image below. You see how these are designed spaces. City planning has moved on from being merely about important buildings, highlighting certain avenues, to almost consciously premeditated action of redesigning city shapes and forms. The other example you are looking at is the Versailles Palace. Now summing up, the determinants in this case are more politics, religion, might and power and aesthetic qualities. Now, having done from pre-modern to Baroque, we will quickly sum up and list all the salient points in the pre-industrial period. Now, there is a quote I have here from Aristotle which says, men come together in cities in order to live and they remain there to live the good life, which means the city somehow symbolizes the good life. The city with its wide avenues, public spaces, it is no longer about subsistence but rather about living the good life. Now, even though the origin of urban settlements, whether it is the proto-settlement we saw in Jericho and Çatalhöyük in the Neolithic phase, or the notion of urban life that you see by the time you are in Baroque or maybe Renaissance, you have to see how as humanity evolves, cities evolve too. So, urbanism and humanity are very interconnected, they are almost inseparable in the evolution pattern. In the summary, the other salient point I want to discuss is based on urban morphology, density, growth pattern from early civilization till late Renaissance and Baroque is determined by human endeavor. The argument is that suddenly the scale character of the city is a response to either the socio-cultural condition, the politics or the human scale. How we experience our cities largely guide in the design of the cities. And then ideas like ideal cities, you know, the pure geometry of ideal cities, of how to make defensive cities, how to organize quarters in a city, all this is determined, or this experimental approach largely comes from an idea of what is this good city form, you know, the normative idea of what is good. It is a quest that has been a part of how we have evolved in our thinking on cities. So, not just here, but in the subsequent sessions when we discuss further into post-industrial cities, we will again see the ideal cities, we will again see utopic ideas of good cities. Now, what was the outcome of this session? Now, this session aimed at explaining the evolution, salient characteristics using determinants as an analyzing factor to look at urban form from ancient period to pre-modern period. I am going to leave you with some questions for this session. Now, the questions are: when and where did the first cities develop in the West? What were they like? How did urban form of cities of the pre-industrial period evolve or change over time? What were the salient characteristics or determinants? Lastly, what are ideal cities? Now, in the next session, we will look at post-industrial urban form in the West and also at Indian urbanism. Thank you.
Right.